kindred friends, and welcome to the Radical Emergence podcast, where we're having conversations at the edge of transformation. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and with me is my friend, co-host, and co-collaborator, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Please check out our bios in the show notes where you'll find links to our work, websites, and can find ways to connect with us. If you're not already following, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they drop.
Hello, everybody. Sally here. This exciting project consists of about 26 episodes in all, dedicated to better defining and understanding transformation on all its levels of reality. That's personal, social, as well as ecological. We're going to ask, what is transformation? Why bother? Why do we need it? And what does it feel like or look like? We'll also ask, can we induce it or perhaps accidentally block it? These are really important questions for growth.
We draw not only on our hard-won life experience, we are also transdisciplinarians. So what the heck is that? Well, it means we want to understand transformation from as many lenses as possible, including formal academic disciplines and discourses, art, media, and popular culture. Importantly, we draw from our living experience.
So we are experts, so to speak, but mostly in just one small but highly critical area, our own suffering, and the medicines that we've both used to transform our own lives. So to this end, we've also added decades of committed practices, as well as formal degrees, including specific in-depth studies in the mechanisms of transformation, because we needed to understand this healing journey for ourselves.
Does this entitle us to help others? You bet. Absolutely. Because it is by sharing our stories, knowledge, and direct experience that we offer sane, sober, practical tools for living on the ground of life. So welcome. Strap in, hang on, and enjoy the ride as we deep dive into a universe of transformation.
Jen and I took a little break, as you probably did, over the Christmas holidays, and we had a bit of a rest, which was awesome. And we decided to start fresh with the final couple of episodes with what we consider to be the keystone episode of our entire podcast. And I'll explain why. This week, we're going to be discussing enlightenment. And we're going to look at how that has evolved over time. What does it mean? Is it even relevant? And pretty much Jen and I would probably both say this entire podcast has been about enlightenment. So this 1 hour is not going to be enough. All the episodes are about what is enlightenment, but we just took little key parts of it and expanded in each episode. So we've been building up to this Keystone episode, and we think it's critical. And both Dr. Jen and I have spent our entire lives fascinated by this topic. So it's really our passion, really our passion. And I'll let Dr. Jen explain to you herself why she's an expert. And all I can say, because I don't want to waste time, if for my own credentials, if you want to know more about my life's journey into the subject of enlightenment, just go to my website. It's sallyadnamsjones.com, and you'll get more information there about the things I've studied. My entire life has led up to enjoying this 1 hour with you right now. So I'm aware of the privilege of that and the excitement, and it's a bit of overwhelm. So if we run over our hour, please bear with us. And if it's too much, just leave. We're here to share what we're passionate about, and it can be a lot of information for some, and for others, this will be baby steps, and they know this stuff already. Here we are, and let's share this hour together, trying to unfold how the concept of enlightenment itself has evolved through time. Is it even relevant anymore? Might be a good question. Is an enlightened being something as mythical as the Himalayan Yeti or the Canadian Sasquatch or the Scottish Loch Ness Monster? Is there even such a thing, or is it made up? That's a relevant question for this century, because people have been discussing enlightenment for 3,000 years. And look at the world, it's in a big mess. So that would be a really good question to ask. Is it even a thing, or are we just continuing with a myth? The other thing we might ask is it relevant, since Nietzsche said God is dead? Does enlightenment even have anything to do with God? And we would say that that was something that was held true at a certain part in our history, and it's evolved since then, and it's more complex. So we're going to share how the idea of enlightenment has actually changed with time, from pre-modern to modern to postmodern to metamodern, which is where we are now in our epochal epistemes. And we will share how enlightenment has been democratized over time, from a kind of a state of perfection in a single guru who held sway over lots of devotees in the pre-modern time, to how we can all find our full potential in metamodern times. That's a very big shift, and it's happened slowly over time. So we'll look at that as well. It's complex. So it's not fake news. Enlightenment is not fake news. It's just evolved over time. So let's get up to date. Let's see how the perennial philosophy, which kind of goes like this: we can be better people if we do certain practices. That's shared by all the religions. That's why it's a perennial philosophy. Has changed over time. How do we do that? So I'd like to start off by discussing the pre-modern idea that the Buddhists came up with. That's in early time, thousands of years ago, called the two truths. The doctrine of the two truths. And that was that we live in materialistic duality, and at the same time, we live in non-duality, a spiritual non-duality. And these coexist. That's the doctrine of the two truths. And Jen and I, of every single episode, have been mentioning this paradox or pair of ducks, and she's going to go into the pair of ducks when we hand it over to her, that these things coexist. It's the great paradox, that duality is a matter of polarities and binaries, and it's held within the oneness. Science itself has established that now as a truth, that there is a quantum field out of which emerges the material, mechanical objects around us. It's kind of the new enlightenment of the two truths, the great paradox or pair of ducks that Jen and I have been referring to. And we have a whole episode, please go back to that, about the nature of reality, the holonic nature of reality that Arthur Koestler described. So find that episode if you'd like to go into what we're talking about, the two truths. We've already been there, done that. I would just like to say that here's a great metaphor. Imagine a puzzle. In that puzzle, there are thousands of little pieces, each with its own little individual outline and characteristic and color scheme. And each of those, when they're fitted together, it's one piece. So this is kind of an easier way to imagine what Kussler spoke about, the holonic nature of reality. There's parts and there's wholes, and we are both. And that is something that is developed over time. And it was right there in the Buddhist teachings, and it's still proven and relevant today by science. So that's kind of one of the things about enlightenment that has stayed consistent, but our scientific understanding of it has deepened with quantum physics. That's a beautiful thing. It's verifiable. The ancient truths were verifiable. We also have an episode on the paradox of emergence and mergence. So go back to that episode that was critical for understanding enlightenment, and I'll explain why. And here's this other beautiful paradox: emergence and mergence. The initial teachings of enlightenment from the pre-modern times were that if you found your true self, you could merge with reality. That was the gift from the East, that you could meditate, sit on a cushion, find enlightenment by merging with the one puzzle, complete puzzle. Your little part became part of the whole. That was the gift given to us by thousands of years of traditions from the East that taught enlightenment. That's what enlightenment was in pre-modern times. In modern times, we now move to the West, and 300 years ago or so, the Western Enlightenment started realizing, no, we're more than just a true self. We're also an individual self. This was new. This was a new idea that we were able to individuate as unique beings. We were not only being, we were becoming. Brand new. Also called the Enlightenment, but this was the Western Enlightenment. And I'm going to quote Kant later on, the idea that we could become rational beings. A new development into the Enlightenment theory. So it's changed. Not only were we true selves if we meditated and could find the oneness, we were now able to be separate selves and individuate and find our agency and become rational beings. So that changed over time. So we could emerge, not only merge, but emerge. We have a whole episode on that if you'd like to catch up with that. So what I'm getting at as an introduction, and I'm going to hand it over to Jen to develop this idea of polarities, that we're constantly dealing with pairs of opposites that can be integrated, first of all, into paradox and held as two truths, and then into unity, a non-dual unity. So that's a progression, a movement, and we've called that integral Taoism, that understanding that is unique to this podcast. So we would say the meta-modern enlightenment, and I will go over how enlightenment changed when I come back. But we would just say that this podcast is meta-modern enlightenment because we're dealing with the movement from binaries to polarities to paradox to unity. It's a movement, a progression, and that is our unique model of enlightenment to this podcast. And it involves polarities and working deeply with the pair of ducks. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Jen. I'd love for you to go further into that. Other words, lots of similes here about duality and non-duality.
Yes, the pair of ducks are finally getting their due on their full due on our podcast. And I'm so excited. And I love, Sally, how you have given us this breakdown of the evolution of enlightenment and this inquiry, like, what does enlightenment like for us now, today, 2024? What does it look like for an ordinary individual to be enlightened? And these are such important questions that we've been exploring on this podcast. It is such an honor to work and play with you, Sally, to love and create with you. We had a nice break. Spent time with our families and celebrated the new year. And we hope that you also had a great holiday season and are feeling well into the new year. So this journey of enlightenment is all about the things we talk about on the show: spiritual healing and self-realization, self-awareness. That is what we call conscious living. That's living with a deep awareness and sensitivity to our inner worlds and how those inner worlds are interacting with our outer worlds. So the podcast is focusing on these very edges of transformation, on the edges of enlightenment and how we are defining enlightenment presently. And a real practical edge that we're exploring is how we can cultivate and generate access and reclaim wisdom for ourselves in a very practical way, and for others, for our earth home and our animal kinfolk. And so wisdom and the cultivation of wisdom is a big part of that journey. All of us are on a journey of transformation. We can't get away from that. But if our journey isn't based in wisdom, isn't based in real values and sincere meaning, then we can fall into a variety of traps and pitfalls. And so we've been exploring how we can effectively avoid those pitfalls that are common on this journey of enlightenment. And also we've been focused on pointing out the opportunities that are coming with that journey of enlightenment. So throughout these episodes, we've been exploring this evolution of consciousness, of enlightenment, of the developmental trajectory of a lifetime, and the healing that can happen along the way on all levels of reality, in our hearts, in our minds, in our bodies, with each other, with our animal kinfolk, and our earth home. Which brings me to the focus of this week that I'm going to focus on, which is paradox, the pair of ducks that is what the ducks, as we affectionately call them on this podcast, and that my beloved mentor, Dr. Constance Jones, taught me and introduced me to years ago when I was in graduate school. She always talked about the pair of ducks. So the pair of ducks has appeared in every single episode. And in simple terms, a paradox is two or more divergent truths that are true at the same time. And sometimes, I just want to point this out from the get-go, sometimes what we think are paradoxes are actually more like logical fallacies that pop up when we have the tendency for dualistic and binary thinking. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in if this, then that thinking that we forget that there are paradoxes and complexities happening all around us all the time. And for an example, I was talking to my mom, who is a baby boomer. She's very steeped in the logic of duality. She's reductionism, subjectivism, individualism, very rational. Things are very black and white in my mom's world, very right and wrong, very either or. And when I was a teenager, I remember very fiercely pushing back against this notion of duality, because I had some awareness that the world did have gray zones in between places, and then there could be opposing truths that weren't contradictory at all. And that's a really strange thing to be aware of as a young person without any kind of a language to express or describe what I was feeling. But there was some feeling of emotional stagnation every time I would discuss things with my mom. And it came because we were relying so much on that dualistic thinking. And so there was no room in our relationship, in our dialogue for any expansion, any growth, any healing or connection, because in that world, there's such a demand for purity and always being right. I'm sure many of you can relate to what I'm saying. And there's something I just didn't trust as a young person about using perception to elevate oneself over our ordinary human foibles and placing others, right? Others on the other side. It felt very stifling. And this is really important to recognize here, that it's a feeling. As a young person, I was attuned to the feeling that the world was much more complex than my mind and my mom were making it out to be, right? There was a heart and gut driven intelligence in me that was aware of that complexity in a way that I just couldn't articulate. So I was talking to my mom recently, and this same pattern appeared. We were talking about someone who committed a violent, very heinous crime, and my mom was super focused on holding this person accountable. In fact, she was solely focused on punishment, that this person should be punished. And I agreed with that. Accountability is important, Mom, yes. But nevertheless, I nudged her in the direction of complexity and paradox and contradiction by mentioning that these behaviors are often rooted in generations of unresolved pain and trauma. And I felt compassion for that chain of pain and unresolved generation trauma. But at the same time, I was fully holding this person accountable. And my mom immediately expressed extreme skepticism that accountability and compassion could coexist. But in my heart, I was feeling into what appeared to be a contradiction, but I knew these two things in my bones, that one, that this person's crimes had to be investigated and tried, and if they were found guilty, they had to be paid for. But on the other hand, there was also a truth that I felt intense compassion for what this person probably went through to get to the point that they are today to do that crime, because crimes like that don't happen in a vacuum. Right? Sociopaths and psychopaths and criminals are rarely born into healthy, harmonious families. And not to say that those don't happen, but most of the time, criminal behavior comes from a long line of horrific behavior, of people who are deeply wounded that continually hurt and wound people. And that is what drives a cycle of violence. So the complexity of accountability and compassion, no matter how challenging, it feels really important to me. Because as long as we're only committed to putting our resources into punishment and judgment without healing and rehabilitation, and as long as we keep pathologizing that pain and trauma instead of meeting it with some compassion and equal amounts of accountability, we are stuck in these hapless cycles of violence that keep happening. And we're actually not dealing with the root of the problem. And as an example, the prison industrial complex profits from people who are perpetually acting out in these horrific, dangerous ways because of unresolved trauma. So our society is not trauma informed, and it doesn't offer meaningful resources to people who are struggling psychologically or with trauma. And yet, even though we don't offer these resources, there's plenty of judgment, shame, and stigma to go around about towards those who commit those kinds of crimes. So one way of combating the problem of crime and high rates of recidivism is to hold people accountable, yes, and hold the paradox that we can provide services, rehabilitation, and supports. We can shift our hearts and minds from feeling and voicing compassion for the way we humans have passed down complex cycles of violence and trauma, and we are not separate from that. That violence touches us all, and we're all in this together. So that's what we're doing on this show. We're working on touching hearts and minds so that we can hold paradox, so that we can hold complexity, we can hold accountability and compassion, two truths that might seem contradictory, but are actually equally important and equally true. Because the more we deprogram and let go of that exclusive dependence on that dualistic and binary thinking, the more paradoxes we start to see. Life is actually full of paradox. We find paradox everywhere we go if we're living conscious lives. And that's because paradox is nothing new. As Sally pointed us to, all the way back 3,000 years ago, we were aware of paradox. There's always been paradox. The real change is in our perception. We're letting go of these dualistic framings that have colored our perception, and what is arising is an awareness of complexity, of many truths. So the goal of enlightenment in 2024 is moving out of these various modes of thinking, and that includes dualism. Duality exists. Can't get away from it. Binaries exist. We need rational thought. This isn't about throwing away that world of duality. It's like Sally's pointing us to, we're integrating that world of duality. The goal is to enjoy duality, play in duality, but not be bound to it, while also playing in that world of paradox and complexity that is all around us, because there's real freedom that comes with this kind of yes and thinking. So enlightenment is about switching perspectives, being nimble, and being able to direct our attention well, so that we're comfortable with these paradoxical tensions. And these tensions open us up to new ways of thinking and being, and new ways of connecting. That is what this episode is all about. So I'm going to stop it there and pass it back to you, Sally. I'm so excited about where we're growing in this episode.
Thanks so much, Jen. And thank you for that story. I think it illustrates beautifully one of the other great paradoxes of Enlightenment teachings, which is about boundarylessness, and the modern addition to that pre-modern practice of finding no boundaries is healthy boundaries. So that's the new meta-modern addition. So this is interesting that Enlightenment now in a meta-modern context holds paradox, but I want to explain how that wasn't always the case. This is the new development. So Jen is absolutely right. We're now on this podcast teaching paradox, we're moving from polarity to paradox to unity, and holding all that duality within the one beautiful metaphor we have, the Tao symbol. It's shadow and light. It's everything. It's not only moving away from real life and sitting on a cushion or in a cave and meditating. That was what the pre-modern Enlightenment was all about, was avoiding suffering, sitting somewhere in a monastery and almost declining real life in order to find what we call the true self, or non-duality, through certain practices, deep meditative practices, all sorts of practices. So that was the emphasis 3,000 years ago on pre-modern Enlightenment. We still have teachers like that today. I would say Eckhart Tolle, with his beautiful book, The Power of Now, is a gorgeous teaching of pre-modern Enlightenment. It's about learning how to meditate and be in the now. Jen and I have spoken, though, about the new developments to that. Is you have to be in the past with your trauma story, and you also have to be now in the future with envisioning a new world. So we include Eckhart Tolle and the pre-modern teachings, but we expand it to include many more things. So let's just go through this briefly. Pre-modern Enlightenment was about finding the non-dual experience of reality. And that had lots of similes. They called it realization, liberation, freedom. So it was an absence of the ego. You were well attained in those days if you dropped away from having any individuation. Perfectly good, true, but partial, because later we developed further. And as I mentioned, the Western Enlightenment, which started 300 years ago, I think, therefore I am, we started realizing, but I am an individual. I can't just obliterate that on the cushion. That's weird, because I'm actually evolving and becoming and finding agency, and I'm becoming more rational and conceptual. So the new Western Enlightenment, only 300 years ago, started bringing on board the thinking being, or the left brain specifically. We've discussed that in earlier podcast episodes. However, we developed beyond what we call modern enlightenment. And about 60 years ago, we came into pre-modern enlightenment, which was the new realization. If you have all these little individuals, wow, they each have their unique perspective. This was brand new. So we fell into a kind of a relativism. But with that came this amazing understanding that the one field is looking through all our eyes and experiencing multiple perspectives. Huge addition to the Enlightenment story. That's postmodernism. And now we come into the gifts of the meta-modern Enlightenment, which is this in a nutshell. How do we bring all the gifts of the previous enlightenments, which include meditative practices to drop out of the self? How do we include the modern gifts, which is science, understandings of the quantum field? Jen and I refer to those gifts all the time. We need objective truths, and we develop our conceptual abilities and cognitive capacities. And then we add the pre-modern gifts, which is, oh my goodness, there's also subjectivity and relativism. How do we include that in our Enlightenment teaching? So metamodernism takes the best of those and understands, wow, we've now got this really complex understanding of what it means to be enlightened. It includes past, present, and future. It includes true self and separate self. It includes subject and object. Look at all the episodes we've been up till now. And Jen and I would describe this as that yin-yang metaphor, that it includes all opposites, the being and becoming, the dual and non-dual, emergence, mergence, yin and yang, male and female, and individual and community, agency and cooperation. So, wow, this is a brand new, very sophisticated Enlightenment teaching. Very different from the pre-modern, very different from the modern, very different from the postmodern. And I would just like to take a minute to thank a couple of teachers Jen and I have drawn on for this new understanding of what we would call integral enlightenment. It integrates all the opposites. We had Arthur Koestler, who came up with the Polonic nature of parts and wholes. We had all sorts of wonderful teachers like Gebser, Claire Graves, who came up with spiral dynamics and actually mapped how people evolve and actually develop the capacity to think of these things. We don't, in childhood, understand this complexity. So we have to develop enough to understand the new Enlightenment. So we have all these wonderful teachers Jen and I have drawn on, and one of those is Ken Wilber. One of those is John Welwood, who came up with the name Grow Up and Wake Up. That is the new Enlightenment. The Wake Up was developed 3,000 years ago in the East, and the Grow Up, which is the therapeutic aspect, is only about 100 years old in the West. So now integral enlightenment, or a new democratic enlightenment available to anybody, not just a guru, is much more integrative than it ever used to be, and complex and sophisticated. And I would suggest, if you're fascinated by these ideas, Jen and I have explained that polarities exist not only at the micro level, in the quantum field with dipolarities, electromagnetic opposites, blah, blah. We've had episodes on that. It exists at the macro level with matter and antimatter, but enlightenment is at the meso-human level. So enlightenment is a specific level of those scales, but it includes as a fractal the whole. It's a human capacity to understand that we're both personal and impersonal at the same time. So I would just like to end this little section before I give it back to Jen by saying, what isn't enlightenment? It is not perfection. It is not infallibility. We know throughout history that some of the most enlightened people have had the darkest shadows. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So the paradox doesn't disappear. Plus, we got to do a lot of work on ourselves to do the grow up part, not just the wake up part. So it's not perfection. It's not infallibility. It's no longer sitting in a cave, hiding on a cushion away from activism and alleviating suffering. So, it's not avoidance. I would say, having spent a lifetime studying, and I've had the great privilege of working with some of the greatest Enlightenment teachers, one of whom is Barbara Marx Hubbard, who I'll talk about next in my next section. One of her definitions really does hit home, and that is that enlightenment is an identity, because with metamodern enlightenment, we realize that we are evolution in action, that the non-dual refracts through the dual in our bodies. So thank you, Barbara. Barbara was one of my greatest mentors and a most brilliant human. So to end this section, I would like to say, we've said what it isn't. Enlightenment is not perfection. It's an identity. And it's dual citizenship, to put it in another way, of both the dual material world where everything has pain and suffering, and it's at the same time citizenship within the big picture of the non-dual. It's dual citizenship. So I'm going to give it back to Jen, and let's see where you take this. I'm excited.
That's so great. I love it. Dual citizenship. Yeah, I love how we're bringing enlightenment into and making it very practical. I think that's one of the problems with enlightenment is it has been reserved for certain people, and that's really unfortunate, because we all are on a journey of enlightenment, I believe, and by bringing that journey into practical terms that we can all access and all understand, then that's the healing. That's the healing move. That's what Joanna Macy calls the great turning. That's what we're looking for, is when we all take seriously this project of coming into enlightenment for ourselves and for each other. So I'm super excited to continue talking about paradox, the pair of ducks. And I want to talk about just some comment. I'm going to just dovetail on what Sally's been talking about, these various paradoxes that we are probably all familiar with. And so let's talk about a few more of those, and then at the end of the show, I want to talk about why Sally and I think leaning into this new notion of practical enlightenment and leaning into paradox is vital. for our survival as a species. So, so here's one paradox. One paradox is that when we're in the moment, in the present moment, in the now, like Eckhart, Sally brought up Eckhart's work. So we're in the now, we're in the present moment. This is a paradox. We're also experiencing our eternal timeless nature, right? The fact that we're both present in this moment and in the past and in the future and in the now, that really blows my mind, because my mind is so tied to that binary logic. I can't imagine being in different places all at once, but that is the truth. Another paradox that has followed me my entire life is the pattern of the breakdown is woven, the breakthrough is woven into the breakdown. Every breakdown I've ever experienced has led to a breakthrough, a significant breakthrough. And it makes me realize that even in a moment of breakdown, that I can trust that there will be a breakthrough. And I can lean into that knowledge of knowing there will be that breakthrough. And if I can be perceptually nimble enough even to welcome the breakdown, I'm more likely to ease gracefully into the breakthrough. And it's incredible how we can find peace in our greatest struggles. What a paradox, right? That we can find peace in our greatest struggles. I also love the paradox that our inner healing is healing the world at the same time. Because as we're always pointing to in this podcast, is that there's a fractal connection between our inner worlds and our outer worlds. So all the healing that we're doing on the inside is benefiting the world at large. So when we feel discouraged or like our work doesn't matter, it's really important to flex our perception and be perceptually nimble enough to remember that the work that we're doing is not just about us. It's important to everyone. And especially when it comes to healing our family lines and our intergenerational trauma. So that's a great paradox. And here's another. There's nothing you need to change about yourself. At the same time, you are healing and growing and developing. We are both perfect and imperfect at the same time. How can that be? How can we be two things at once? Seems to me that people kind of want you to be one way or the other. And that's unfortunate that we shame each other to be one way or the other, when what we could do is encourage each other to recognize that we are both perfect and imperfect at the same time. There's so much freedom and movement in that flex. Another paradox is that you've probably heard this. It said that the more that you know, the more you realize you don't know, because there's so much we do not know. And then there's lots of things that you do know. There's all kinds of things that you know for sure. So paradoxes abound in the realm of knowing and unknowing. And so what I want to point out in all of these examples of paradox that Sally has pointed to, that I've pointed you to in these everyday paradoxes, is that you'll see that they help us get over our tendency and kind of addiction to thinking in binary terms, and they open us up to yes and thinking. They open us up to more subtle feelings, and they help us break free from this stagnation that we get bound up in when we are overly committed to reductionist thinking. So paradoxes are helping us explore these deeper truths that lie just below the surface of our logical minds, and they help us see the world and ourselves more holistically, from a more holistic frame. And so conscious living and enlightenment, it really requires developing a tolerance for paradox. And Sally brought up the yin yang symbol. We have brought up almost as much as we've brought up the pair of ducks, we have brought forward the yin yang symbol, and it has been a guiding light on this show. And we talk about it because this circle around the symbol is representing the complexity of those divergent, contradictory, yet intertwining truths, right? So when we talk about what integrating the opposites in the new meta-modern Enlightenment, what we're talking about is that circle that holds the symbol that is divided by two halves in a curved line with one black and one white dot on either side, right? So that circle is a representation of our ability to hold the unity of opposites. The circle is the tolerance for paradox. When we're focused on one side or the other, we may not use our perceptual ability we may not be perceptually nimble in order to see the whole picture. We may not see the whole picture that holds the opposites together. And in order to develop some confidence with the tension of paradox, I'm going to need to step back and reflect on that circle that holds those opposites, because that circle is more representative of our awareness of the whole than our ability to focus on either side. The circle is the guiding light that brings me back to my capacity to hold complexity with grace. Danish physicist Niels Bohr wrote, he said, quote, "How wonderful that we have met with paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress." Yes, indeed. Now that we have met with paradox, now we can grow. All right, I'm going to end it there and pass it back to you, Sally. And I know you hold the tension of paradoxes gracefully in your life. I love to hear more about how you do that.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I want to reiterate a very special thing you said there, which is that as we transform the whole field. That is the fractal nature and the power of really co-creating with our own transformation. We co-create the universe as it evolves. I've got goose flesh. Like that, when you get that, it's, as you said earlier, it's an obligation. It's a brilliant enlightenment, and we start serving. So just to get back to the paradoxes, I used to be the director of a residential education center for Enlightenment studies, and we shared the teachings of a wonderful monk from India called Baba Haridas. He was our teacher, and this is something he said. And he's coming out of the pre-modern Enlightenment tradition, but he was also extremely practical and contemporary. He said, "The embodied soul has two purposes to fulfill: experience the world and get liberation from all experiences." There's the great paradox right there. So that's fully embody the duality and also discover the non-duality while you're about it. That's the dual citizenship right there. So for this little section together, I'd like to just give a few citations which really illustrate how the notion of enlightenment itself has evolved, because everything is evolving, including the idea of enlightenment. Why would that be any different? So we've spoken about the beautiful offerings of the two truths from Buddhism, and how we've incorporated that now into the idea of paradoxes, and how we also understand that we have to draw from each of these epochs the best and leave what didn't work behind. What didn't work with pre-modern Enlightenment teachings was it's sexism. Buddhism used to think that women couldn't ever be enlightened. They'd have to come back and be a boy. So, you know, there were ideas in early Enlightenment teachings like racism or sexism. Some early traditions felt they were the only chosen people. There were hierarchies of power. There was abuse. We leave those behind. We bring forward, though, the gifts, which are the practices from the pre-modern era. The gifts of the modern era would be the rational thinking, and we leave behind the shadow of modernism, which is the hyper addiction to individuality and left brain chauvinism and objectivity, hyper objectivity. But we bring forward the gifts. And the Western Enlightenment, I'm going to use Kant as an example. This is in a 1784 essay that he wrote, What is Enlightenment? And he said, Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage. I love that word. Nonage is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. And this enlightenment requires nothing but freedom. Freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. So we bring that forward. Yes, we need to stay reasonable. And we leave the shadow of modernity behind. We're moving out of that now, actually. It's destroying our planet. We have to really reconsider. Then there were beautiful teachers that came along like Alan Watts. He's one of my favorites because he could draw out what we call the perennial philosophy, the great truths that all religions share. He was gifted in that. He taught about 80 years ago, and he introduced the importance of feelings, not just rational thought of Kant, but feelings and states. And he said this feeling of being lonely and very temporary visitors in the universe is in flat contradiction to everything known about man and all living organisms in the sciences. We do not come into this world, we come out of it as leaves from a tree. As the ocean waves, the universe peoples. Every individual is an expression of the whole realm of nature, a unique action of the total universe. And this fact is rarely, if ever, experienced by most individuals. Even those who know it to be true in theory do not sense or feel it, but continue to be aware of themselves as isolated egos inside bags of skin. So in other words, the separate self becomes predominant in modern life. We lost track of the true self in modernity. So meta-modernity brings those two together, the true self and the separate self, the wake up and the grow up. And we understand this now as not only the states of heightened consciousness that the pre-modern teachers taught us, but also the stages of development that modern psychology has brought us, integral psychology. So we've got more work to do than the pre-moderns, and we're dual citizens now. We're not just sitting on the mat anymore. We're fully engaged with the world, and we're serving evolution and doing what Alfred North Whitehead said, we're relentlessly moving into novelty. We are creative beings, and non-duality works through our duality. So we also now understand enlightenment as presence with whatever is, darkness and light, suffering and pain and pleasure and bliss. We're present to it all. And John Wellwood, who came up with Wake Up and Grow Up, had this to say. I love this, because now we're just going to toss out all those old ideas. He says, forget about enlightenment. Sit down wherever you are and listen to the wind singing in your veins. Feel the love, the longing and the fear in your bones. Open your heart to who you are right now. Not who you would like to be, not the saint you're striving to become, but the being right here before you, inside you, around you. All of you is holy. You're already more or less than whatever you can know. breathe out, touch in, and let go. So 2 quick quotes before I give it back to Jen, because these are like contradictory, and Jen and I say this is all true. This is all true. I want to refer briefly to a great contemporary colleague of ours, Jeff Brown, who has thrown the concepts of enlightenment right out the window, and he calls them enrealment, which is waking down instead of waking up. And I love his teachings. This is what he has to say. The quest for enlightenment bores me and distracts me from the real work required to truly grow. It's so up there, and my challenges are so down here. The karmic field of my soul is expansion and is in the heart of the imperfect patterns. It's in the transforming fires of daily experience. It's in the heat of my real life, not the projected perfect life, but right here in this blessed and aging body temple. It's all I can do to embody my humanness. I have no time to waste striving to rise above it. The imperfect quest for an authentic life is perfect enough for me. So we're throwing lots of ideas, they're all true but partial. So holding that complexity, we wake down, we wake up, we wake out, we wake in, everything is included. That's the truth of Tantra. Nothing is excluded from the whole. That's the Tao. So final quote, and I love Adyashanti. He's one of the great contemporary Enlightenment teachers. So I'm just really trying to bring in a few of our colleagues who are doing great work. We don't only have to go to the old perennial pre-modern texts. We've got people writing right here, right now about the new Enlightenment. This is really important to hear this one, because in his view, enlightenment is the destruction of illusion. That's quite different from dual identity. Make no mistake about it, Adyashanti says. Enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything you imagined to be true. I'm going to leave it at that. So I would love to wish you all a great week, and I can't wait to be with you again. We've only got a couple more episodes left, and I'm going to give it back to Jen to wrap up this extraordinary paradox of the Enlightenment teachings themselves.
I'm so glad you brought forth Adyashanti and Jeff Brown and temporary teachers of enlightenment wisdom, and how important that is to giving a new definition, new awareness of what enlightenment can be and why it's important for all of us right now. It's not just some far-reaching concept. It's practical. It's every day. It's what we're doing in our everyday lives. That is what enlightenment is all about. It is being, like Sally said, it is about being present with whatever is. This is the new enlightenment. And we have been talking about the stifling nature of modernism and dualism, and how practical enlightenment is leaning into paradox and complexity, subtlety, which offers movement, which offers freedom. Paradoxes lead us into new levels of awareness and understanding that we need right now. And that awareness and understanding comes from engaging with ideas and each other creatively, dancing with possibilities, not rushing into uncertainty with a need to be right or wrong, to know or not to know, or to claim intellectual or spiritual superiority. The new enlightenment is about playing with paradox, and that requires a tolerance for uncertainty, expecting uncertainty. Because the new enlightenment is going to thrive in the environments where we don't feel shamed for not knowing, where we don't feel shamed for not having all the answers. One of the most beautiful things I think we can say, one of the most spiritual things, one of the most enlightened things I believe we can say and make a practice of saying several times a day is, I don't know. A heartfelt, I don't know. And that I don't know leaves the door open so that the magic of paradox can enter and blow our minds, because the world is really full of unknowns. And when we approach the world of uncertainty with playfulness, with practical enlightenment, we realize that reality is a lot more complex than our binary assumptions. And that's a pretty humbling realization. According to Plato, Plato said, I am the wisest man alive, for I know nothing. For I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing. The paradox of paradoxes. So this show is an invitation to play with paradox, with practical enlightenment, to build tolerance to paradox so we can amplify our journey towards enlightenment and the emergence into unity. Because when we open up to that complexity and we stop relying on this binary logics and reductionism, we open up to new opportunities for healing. And so much of our unsustainable behavior as a species on this planet is driven by that individualistic and binary thinking, by our lack of tolerance to paradox. And we believe, Sally and I believe, that our best hope as a species on this planet lies in our ability to embrace this practical enlightenment, to embrace complexities, uncertainties, systems thinking, and a trauma-informed approach so that we can heal our deepest wounds together. Well, quack, quack. We want to thank the pair of ducks for joining us for episode 22 of the Radical Emergence podcast. We have just a few episodes left on this project, which has definitely been a work of heart for Sally and I. I want to leave you with a quote from the musical goddess and bona fide badass, paradox lover, Joan Jett. Joan said, "Life is strong and fragile. It's a paradox. It's both things. Like quantum physics, it's a particle and a wave at the same time. It exists all together." We have been so fortunate for your time today. Please let us know what you're thinking and feeling. We love hearing from you. And if you have feedback, insight, questions, please get in touch with us. Until next time, be well.
So thanks for joining us. And we hope you can take away some helpful tools, perhaps some great stories, and some wisdom for your own ongoing journey.
Join us for our next episode, where we will deep dive again into a universe of transformation.